why did you become economist? Why economics? Eto, I'll be honest with you because my father is a lawyer. Diba? My uncles are businessmen, doctor, diba?
Yeah.
Parang tangible sa akin yung what that means eh. Diba? I see them behind the desk. But an economist, if you tell me nung bata ako, diba? Parang, when did you even have an idea of what an economist is?
Ako, pre-law ko lang yung econ.
So, lawyer din ang target mo?
Either lawyer or doctor, yung super traditional na choices. Kasi yung guardians ko both ay lawyers sila. So, parang, econ as a pre-law lang talaga siya. So, it was only much later na na-realize ko na, nakakabuhay pala si econ. Hindi ka pala mamumulubi kung career mo yung econ.
Much later, meaning nasa college ka na, nasa econ ka na?
Actually, even beyond that, na parang, kasi nag 1 year ako sa UP Law, and then sabi ko, na-miss ko yung numbers. Na-miss ko yung charts. And then later on, nag-masters ako. So, parang doon ko lang siya na-discover na, okay pala tong career.
But I would think by the time nag-masters ka, it's because nag-masters na ako kasi alam ko na. Di ba? Especially after leaving law. Di ba? Parang, but kailan nabuo sa, like for example, if you think, hindi, pre-law ko lang naman yan eh. But I know somebody whose major in UP was drums in music. Yun yung pre-law niya. Di ba? Parang, bakit econ yung pre-law mo?
Well, actually, historically, yung mga econ grads, I think sa data din, lumalabas sa data na parang they're doing well in law school. Even si VP Lenny, halimbawa, and many others na galing sa UP Econ, may track record talaga na parang somehow, I'm not sure exactly, siguro yung combination ng logic, policy, etc. Parang all of that somehow prepares you for life in the law. Pero na-realize ko din na even in the Philippines, na halimbawa yung ADB nandyan lang, na parang you can really make a career out of economics pala. Na parang, it's not something that many people know about, and konti lang naman din yung mga nagme-major o pinipili yung econ as a major, pero okay din siya. Parang, it's a good thing so far.
Ikaw, Cielo.
Ako, gusto ko talagang maging musician eh. I grew up with my lola and lolo. Yung lolo ko was a lawyer. And then yung lola ko, pianist. So I actually wanted to be a pianist. Second option ko yung to be a lawyer, like my lolo. Pero mahilig talaga ako sa discussion ng politics eh. So kahit nung bata pa ako, yung lolo ko, madalas kong kausap yan about social issues, politics. But nung pagpasok ko sa UP, syempre yung mga magulang lagi sinasabi, dapat business course kuhanin mo. So napadpad ako sa economics. Business econ ako noon. And then, along the way, na-appreciate ko siya na, no, this is what I want. Ito yung tool na nagbibigay sa akin na binibigyan niya ako ng analytical tool eh, na strengthen yung analysis ko, yung interest ko sa politics, nandito na. So, similar to JC, I was thinking of going to law school then. But at that time, ito na yung pumasok na yung student council. Naging USC chair ako. Pero mid-year kasi ako gumraduate kasi concert chorus din ako. Then I had to stay. So, nag-masters ako. Nung USC chair na ako, nasa master's program na ako ng economics.
Okay.
So, nagtuloy-tuloy na siya. That's why, nung nag-PhD ako, instead of PhD in economics, I chose a multidisciplinary program, which is law and public policy, with focus on microeconomic policy. Kaya may PhD in law ako.
Okay. But in the middle of all of that, ano yung namuo sa'yo? Parang when you say na, okay, naiintindihan ko na. But you're saying, naiintindihan ko na, pwede rin pala ako kumita dito eh. Di ba? Pwede, mabubuhay naman pala ako dito. May mga racket naman pala to. I think people can understand that. But what crystallized in you na ito ang economist, or more to the point, ito ang economics. This is what economics is to an individual, to a young person considering, paninindigan ko na ba to?
Yeah. Well, yung economics kasi, it's not also just numbers eh. It's also study of human behavior. It's an understanding on how people make decisions. So, it can be applied to politics. It can be applied to anything. And for me, because I'm already interested in politics, even before I went into economics, mas na-reinforce yung idea na yon na, this is really complementing my interests. Kaya tinuloy-tuloy ko na siya. And then I don't have to be a lawyer because I'm married to one.
He'll handle that part.
Ikaw, JC, ano ibig sabihin ng economics
Well, I guess, Robbie, na-realize ko din na parang grabe yung applicability ng econ na parang just about in any field or of interest na pwede mo siyang ma-apply in a way. Na parang, sabi ko, sobrang versatile niya na field. And especially when you're talking about public policy, yung mga policies ng government officials, halimbawa, and to think na yung mga policies na yun, crafted by economists. So parang economists as a whole, they are such in a great position to influence the lives of millions of people. In a way na halimbawa kung doktor ka, di ba? Parang one patient at a time. Pero kapag ka-economist ka, parang millions ang potential na maapektuhan mong buhay for good or
That's
bad,
true.
of course. Pero grabe yung power, I think, din in economics.
Pero yun yung sometimes I talk to my kids about it, yung psychic reward of what you're doing. Kasi pagka economists are talking about policy, and let's say you're advocating for reforms, it takes forever to actually see results. As opposed to a doctor. Kung meron kang ginamot na pasyente, gumaling yung pasyente, yung feeling ng fulfillment nandun agad. And that's what's difficult with respect to a field na social science. Kasi your expectation of change impact, medyo mahaba-haba siya because you're trying to change society. So kailangan mo ng mahabang patience.
But I mean, give me an example. Give me an example of, it doesn't have to be something that you worked on, but simple economic policy of the past decades, na dahil ginawa yung simple policy tweak na yan, apektado yung pamilya mo, nangyari to sa pamilya, for good or bad. Give us an example. I'm trying to imagine kasi, parang, let's say mga bata, or my kids, or your kids, or people saying na, Tito, hindi ko alam kung anong course ko sa college. Make that real for me.
I think ang mabibigay ko na example yung 4Ps, yung Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, na ngayon flagship, as in parang synonymous na siya sa government aid, di ba? Na parang kung 4Ps beneficiary ka or hindi. Actually, ang origins niyan is an economic study na parang yung tinatawag na randomized control trials done in Mexico and other countries. And then we adopted those studies or we did those studies here in the Philippines. And parang, parang isang economic study.
What does it essentially prove? Di ba? Alam ko kasi yung 4Ps, di ba? Parang tutulungan yung mga pinakamahirap talaga. But what does it ultimately prove? In terms of ano yung pangangailangan ng mga mahihirap? And then how does that, di ba? Kasi ang dami nun eh. Tapos magtatali-tali, parang papasok yung bata, garantisado papasok yung bata. So, what does it ultimately prove?
Well, it proves that you can actually improve people's lives, in their education, their health, even with a relatively simple intervention like yung konting pera na matatanggap nila, conditional on ipapadala nila yung bata sa health center, sa eskwelahan, etc. That is something na hindi siya straightforward actually. It sounds simple, yung ganung idea, pero it actually takes rigorous study to prove that. And economists were able to prove that in other contexts, in other countries. And then, with the success of those research, parang nadap natin sa Pilipinas. And now, fast forward decades later, is a full-blown, may batas na nga, 4Ps law, and then ang daming natutulungan na tao. So, I think that's one powerful example of the power of economic research to really influence millions of people.
Ikaw, bigyan mo ka ng isang example.
Something that I've worked on. Ito talaga advocacy on the issue of mining. Before we introduce a discussion that yung relationship ng mining and development, the issue of mining in the Philippines is really centered on human rights and the environment. So I became part of a coalition. I led a movement. We call it Bantay Kita. And we introduced another thinking on the issue of mining, and it's the relationship between mining and development. And the introduction of the idea ng resource curse. Resource curse kasi is an development economic context na anong nangyayari dyan? Bakit maraming mayayamang bansa na mayayaman sa minerals na nananatiling mahirap? So yun yung resource curse na explanation ng economics na because these are non-renewable resources, if we don't invest them properly, properly, meaning you invested in human capital, infrastructure, so that you translate the resources that were extracted into something that will help community development. Magkakaroon ka talaga ng resource curse. That's one. Second is a discussion on fair share. Na ibig sabihin, yes, may damage sa environment, may violation ng human rights, but we also have to discuss how much we're getting as payment for these minerals. Yung taxation aspect, nami-miss natin yun lagi. But the discussion na, okay, itong mga taxes na to na ini-impose sa minerals, this is actually our payment because we own the minerals. Hindi yan lumalabas sa conversation. So from an economic perspective, you actually model, compute all the taxes paid, and you can show the public na, okay, sa 100% profit ng mining, 30 to 40% lang napupunta sa atin as owner, ha? 60% napupunta dun sa mga nagmimina. Is that fair share? I think this paradigm na i-introduce by using economic concepts, na i-expand yung narrative on discussion of sustainability, on why some areas are still, unfortunately, not benefiting from mining, and how we can make this sustainable. Pero ang challenge dun, dahil economic concept siya, kailangan ng continuous conversation, openness sa idea, and yun, lobbying, asking people to understand, plan, mobilize, so that they can be more active in terms of pushing for these concepts.
Because, bago ang lahat, kausap po natin si JC Punongbayan at saka si Cielo Magno, content creators.
Sideline.
Mga academics professors.
Pinakamakukulit na faculty sa school.
Kilala nyo na naman po. Both happen to be faculties at the UP School of Economics. They are both now on social media with their followings on Facebook, on Twitter, also now on TikTok. And I'm fascinated by, how you carry on this conversation. I was telling JC, and hindi kita binobola nun, I was saying, what you guys are doing, and not just the two of you, but I think there's this generation of young economists now that are doing for economics what Ambet Ocampo did for history. Diba? Making people realize na, okay, masaya naman palang pag-usapan to. Is economics all about money? Is that I mean, equitable sharing, all of that, papasok natin yan. But at the end of the day, parang is there any other way to appreciate economics?
As I said, economics is also a study of human behavior. There's a field in economics called game theory. So it's understanding behavior, strategizing, what are the best moves. Niloloko ko palagi mga estudyante ko when I teach micro and introduce the concept of game theory. Na at some point, you will apply this concept sa love life mo eh. What is the best move? Kakausapin ko ba tong taong to o hindi? Babasta din ko muna siya, baka mas may bigger reward.
Economics din yan.
Yeah! So kung ano yung sa mga choices ng action mo, which one would be the most strategic and most rewarding to you? That's economics.
Marami pang examples like in the US, yung mga tinatawag ng kidney exchange. Halimbawa, kung yung kailangan mo ng transplant, and then merong pilang mahaba dun sa allocation, dun sa pagkukunan ng sa matching, limited resources.
Demand.
Okay, so yung mismong matching na yun, na parang what's the best algorithm to use to match kung sino yung may pangangailangan ng kidney versus kung sino yung willing mag-donate ng kidney, and then do that efficiently. That's not monetary per se, pero parang it's more of allocation of resources.
Okay, so how do you allocate that? I mean, we never mind all the horror stories about, organ sales, diba? But how do you solve something like that? I mean, that's a real problem. It's a bidding war for kidneys, for example, and therefore it is in fact there is a black market that's created, and it is ultimately the rich who are first in line.
There are two experts, Posner and Becker, actually wrote an article on the creation of market for internal organs or kidneys. Because the idea nga is because by donation siya, nagkakaroon ka ng black market for people who are actually willing to pay for the kidneys. Diba? So I'm not saying I agree. Pero yung sinasabi nila, if you have a system that's working, a healthcare system that's working, even if the kidneys for sale, and you're low income, your healthcare system should be able to allow you to afford or have access to kidneys that are for sale. And then maybe because you created the market, it also encourages other people to donate the other kidney. So mas magkakaroon ng increase in supply, manage mo yung demand. Of course, ito yung may another book, The Moral Limits of the Market. So pinapabasa ko rin yan sa mga estudyante ko. But these are ideas wherein economics would step in and actually provide some solutions that maybe to some extent walang discussion on morals. Because for example, yung sa air pollution, di ba, when you sell emission permit, for some people, that's like giving people rights to pollute. Right? But at the same time, on a regulatory aspect, it's very effective because you're already able to set how much pollution you're allowing to be emitted. And given the quantity, makokontrol mo na kung ilang emission permit yung i-distribute mo. And that emission permit is distributed based on the efficiency kung kanino most valuable yung emission permit na yun. So that's the market. So yung question ng the limits of the market and morality is always an issue na nare-raise. And I guess that's where policymakers would have to process and see how this can be applied or not. Another example.
Wait, teka muna. Kasi I want to explore that a bit because I get it when we talk about pollution. Nobody wants pollution. Everybody wants to cut down on pollution. But the limits of the market, I think, is precisely where you run into ethical questions, moral questions, di ba? I want to bring it back to kidneys. And then ikaw, parang, what are some topics that for you, economics is convenient for me precisely because it allows me to talk about things that are, if you just put it in moral terms, are actually very hard to talk about. What are some other examples of that?
Well, actually, yung tinatawag ni Alvin Roth, isang Nobel laureate, I think 2007 or around that, nanalo siya. Yung repugnant transactions na, halimbawa, doon sa kidneys, na you wouldn't really normally think of putting a market for kidneys. Pero when you think of it, market, parang hindi naman talaga siya kailangan na may price tag parate. When you talk about markets, parang what are the ways by which you can allocate resources more
it's the
broadly?
Supply and the demand.
Supply and demand match that. Halimbawa, you can also apply that dun sa admissions, college admissions, halimbawa. That's something that I worked on before. In the context of UP, for example, ang tanong ay, how do you balance excellence and equity? Kasi on the one hand, you want to get yung top, yung best students, di ba? Pero on the other hand, paano naman yung mga underrepresented groups or yung mga cultural minority groups? So parang there's an inherent tension in that. So the way you solve that is you design yung mga algorithms, yung mga formulas na ginagamit to admit, and that's economics actually. So parang going back to the idea na very broad yung applicability.
But how do you apply it when you're in the middle of the game? You're in the middle of this experiment called the Philippines. And for example, in education, socialized tuition started in our generation. I keep wondering, did that work? Because now, as everybody knows, and it's the old cliche, you go to UP now, puro kotse. Diba? And so you wonder, diba? That really is how people illustrate to themselves.
But it also changed. Hindi na STFAP sa UP ngayon. Free tertiary
Exactly.
education na.
Diba? All the more.
Diba?
Economic insights, and even however you define progressive, but the most progressive and let's say even the most proven economic concepts. How do you apply it midstream when ang lalim-lalim na ng ugat to this point, di ba? Inequity in education. Never mind indigenous peoples, di ba? And indigenous communities. The fact is, I don't think this is a false, but karamihan ng magtatap sa UPCAT will be from private schools. Di ba? And then rural schools, you could represent with a quota system, but you also know that there is a sacrifice there on excellence, not through their fault, but actually as victims of a grade school and high school public education system that never really gave them a leg up. Now, it's there. So how do you strike that balance midstream?
Actually, it's not really just the application of economic concepts and economic as a field para i-correct yung mga maling sistema. It's actually at the minimum we
politics.
have to be, yes, politics significantly, but also data-driven policy making. Kasi maybe we're we're making it intimidating pa sinabi na, let's apply economics in solving policies.
Yeah.
But at the minimum, it's actually data-driven policy making, and economics will help you generate those data.
Okay, I get that. Multidiscipline, we need political will, we need to bite the bullet, you need politicians taking risks also. But let's get back to something very simple. What in Philippine life can you improve? If you just had, ito, isang simple economic, lang. I saw your post. But give me an example.
Well, I think ang low-hanging fruit ay yung sa traffic management. Applying economics to that, several studies have already shown, halimbawa, there are many economic solutions kung bakit laging traffic, bakit lalong lumalala yung traffic. Pero actually, when you, for example, ang problema kasi, hindi kasi na-internalize ng mga motorista yung cost that they impose on other people. Like when you buy a car, the space taken up by your car, that affects pedestrians, cyclists, other people using the road. Pero
and that's
hindi
an economic point, diba? When you buy a car, you are in fact buying real estate.
Exactly.
Diba?
Exactly.
It's moving real estate.
Exactly. So halimbawa, may mga solutions like congestion pricing. What if yung EDSA, imbes na totally free, i-charge natin ng fee yung mga gumagamit ng kotse, halimbawa. And that's been applied in places like Singapore and many other places. Very effective. Pero going back to your point, Robby, na on the one hand, may economic solutions, pero on the other hand, how do you change policies in the middle of the game? Na parang, how feasible is it to change the culture, yung car-dependent culture that we have? Yung mga photos recently, nitong long weekend, yung sa Baguio, di ba? Na parang literal standstill.
Sa Session, that's on Session Road, yung pinost ko sa Facebook.
Sa Burnham, I think around Burnham. Grabe, parang, pero if you think of it, yung mismong pagtayo ng mga huge expressways, yun naman yung tawag na induced demand. So, going back to supply and demand, na kapag merong bagong expressway, initially, bibilis yung biyahe mo. So, pero that incentivizes people to buy cars, and then ang ending, we have more cars in total. So, supply and demand.
Yung mga taga-Alabang, alam yan.
So, yung mga UP, puro kotse. Mas magaganda pa yung mga sasakyan ng Katipunan.
So, it's not just about, widening the roads, because actually the saying that if you build it, they will come.
Exactly.
Also has a bad edge to it. Ikaw, give me it. So, induced demand is one concept. Give me an economic concept na kung maintindihan ng mga Pilipino, parang...
ito, tinest ko na to kasi, yung babalikan ko yung education. Tinetest ko to sa mga taxi driver na nasasakyan ko, halimbawa mahaba-habang biyahe. I'll ask them, what do you think of the free tertiary education? So, sasabihin nila, ma'am, maganda po yan kasi libre na yung tertiary education. Diba? But the question is, again, okay yan kung unlimited ang resources natin But if you have limited resources, would you allocate more on tertiary education or primary and secondary? Diba?
Libre na ang primary.
Oo nga, pero ang dami pa rin kulang. Kulang ng classroom, training ng teachers, kulang ang teachers, nag-overlap yung mga estudyante natin hanggang hating gabi nag-aaral dahil staggered yung pagpasok nila, diba? So that's one question I asked them. So if you have limited resources, would you allocate it sa tertiary or sa primary and secondary? That's one. Second, libre nga yung education sa UP. Makakapasok ba yung anak mo sa UP? Syempre, hindi natin pwedeng ibaba yung quality ng tertiary education. Overall, hindi lang sa UP. Because that translates to human capital And that translates to our competitiveness as a nation. So, dapat ang humabol yung primary and secondary. Ngayon, kung i-maintain natin ang quality ng tertiary education, sino ang papasa sa tertiary education? Adi mga taga-private school na kayang magbayad ng mahal na tuition fee. So, sino ang nakikinabang sa free tertiary education? Is it really the low-income household na gusto nating iangat?
Or it goes back to our conversation, mga may kotse na.
May mga kotse. And that's why UP now is full of individuals with cars, diba? That's one concept ng economics. So limited resources, better allocation sa primary and secondary. Second, yung mga tao na nasa UP na, yung mga anak ng mga mayayaman, they will pay for their tertiary education. They will pursue tertiary education whether it's free or not.
That's true.
Then why are you making it free if they're willing to pay for it?
Ito, hindi ako nagmamataas, but that's true. When my son entered UP as a freshman, that was, I think, the first year na linibre yung completely, and I really felt, it's not about guilt but I felt like, No, I'm willing
You can
to pay.
pay, right?
I'm willing to pay. So sinabi ko, ask the registrar, how can I pay? There's no system.
Right.
There's not even a button to say, but if you would like to give it, di ba, parang okay
Meron,
na.
pero ang habang process. In fact, hindi lang ikaw yung
Parang
magulang
ayaw yung pera mo, di ba? Parang,
hindi lang ikaw yung magulang na ganyan kasi I think I was college secretary nung may mga na-implement din yan. May mga estudyante na gustong magbayad ng tuition fee nila kasi nga the parents can afford. And yet, kailangan mo pa ng waiver, ang daming bureaucratic process na kailangan mo pagdaanan just because you want to pay the tuition. So parang, ay, wag na lang. Well, hindi ko na lang dilibre ko na lang. But that's a concrete example. So, by the time nakarating kami mula Makati hanggang Quezon City, na-convince ko na yung taxi driver na hindi nga maganda yung tertiary.
what's a more accessible term for people to understand? When we say na dapat kasama to sa pag-iisip ng mga tao, ano yung
Bako bebenta ko economics. Economics is the best of both worlds. You get political science, you get the business ad. So, mas marami ka actually market na mapupuntahan kung ang pinag-aralan mo economics eh. Kasi yung from a practical point of view, hindi lang yung mag-discuss ng politics, but if you're pursuing a career, kapag economics yung field mo, yung available na trabaho sa mga gumraduate ng business ad, available din sa'yo. Yung mga gumraduate na trabaho, more or less, sa social sciences, like doing research, community organizing, all these things, pwede mo i-apply yung natutunan mo sa economics to complement those fields. So, broader, I think the options are...
Pero ako sa lahat ng mga sinabi mo, ang isang tumatak sa akin. Yung sinabi na, it's also about behavior.
Yeah.
No? It's actually a lot like psych.
Yes.
Di ba? On a higher level. Parang, ba't niya ginawa yun?
Yeah.
Di ba? Ba't niya ginawa yun? Or bakit ayaw natin gawin yun? Or bakit...
So yun nga, kung i-analyze mo yung nililigawan mo, liligawan ko pa ba to o hindi? In-explain yun ni Nash. Dun sa, hindi pa siguro pinapanganak si JC nun, but yung movie, Beautiful Mind.
Ay, pinanood namin yung Thrice in high school.
High school na pala siya nun.
Ganun, kaya memoryado ko ng lines.
Diba? He explained the behavior na kapag pumasok ka sa bar, you don't go after the most beautiful person. Diba? That's game theory eh. You go to the...
Medyo ka-level ko to.
Yung sa hindi masyado. Kasi mai-insecure yung pinakamaganda na ba't walang lumalapit sa akin? Diba? And then that person becomes accessible to you na. Diba? That's the explanation. So it's actually a study of human behavior and how they respond to incentives.
Okay, speaking of human behavior, bakit maraming corruption?
Ayan ang...
and another, is corruption, especially in our country, is it an explanation unto itself? Kasi ganyan naman yung mga tao. Bakit lubak-lubak? Ay, corruption. Diba? Bakit ganyan? Bakit maraming mayaman? Maraming mahirap? Kaunti yung mayaman? Dahil corruption. But does corruption actually explain anything?
It exists everywhere. Hindi lang naman sa Pilipinas may corruption. Kasi it's about greed. It's unlimited. Walang...
Hindi, pero yun yung point ko. Is it greed? Yun naman,
It is greed.
Yun naman ibig sabihin natin di ba? When we say, corruption yan, it's greed dahil merong gahaman, merong ano. But ang point ko nga is, we get that greed can be, can be sociopathic, di ba?
Yes.
We get then that greed can be against our social interest. But obviously, it's not enough to say, corruption. Diba?
Yes.
So, parang ang inaano ko lang as economist, pagka kinutkot nyo yun, diba, the next question is, ba't may corruption?
So, ang next step doon, as economists, from a study of behavior, then we have to provide a lot of, you have to design a system, an institutional arrangement, either law, organizational, that would change that behavior. So, kaya nagkakaroon tayo ng batas, audit, transparency, accountability mechanisms to make sure na yung mga batas na to, nalilimitahan yung capacity nila na mangurakot. So, if you put that in place. Pangalawa...
So, it's disincentives?
Yes.
Okay.
Disincentives or rules of the game.
Okay.
So, if you have clear rules of the game that will limit greed. So, that's the goal, nalilimitahan yung corruption. That's first. And then the second, again,
kasi meron akong example. Itetest ko ulit yung ano niya.
Sige. And then the second one is yung relationship between the people and the politician. Sa atin kasi, ang tingin kong nakikita kong relationship natin ay meron tayong politician, pinipili natin yung politician because meron tayong relationship sa kanila, makakakuha tayo ng favor from them. kaya natin sila pinipili. Malapit tayo sa kanila. And this is also what I'm trying to change the perspective. Ito yung sa econ, principal agent, na hindi natin actually kailangan humingi ng pabor or maging malapit dito sa politician
Kung
na
may
to.
sistema sana.
Kung may sistema at malinaw kung anong relationship Hindi mo boss yung politician. Ikaw yung boss ng politician kasi ikaw nagpapasweldo dyan. Taxpayer ka, you have the right to demand this service. So if you change that perspective, magbabago din yung relationship ng citizens and politicians.
In-spell out na nga ni Pinoy yun. Di ba? Sinabi nga ni Pinoy, kayo ang boss ko. Di ba? I don't think that helped. Di ba? At the end of the day, there was a parang yung mga tao, no? Parang tama yun. Tama yan. Di ba? Kami ang boss nyo. But at the end of the day, did it systemically change anything? Again, yung tanong ko, how do you get past the conversation about it's just greed? We have to, as was once said in the past administration, you just have to moderate the greed, and things will be.
We know what administration is.
But how do you implement something, an economic mechanism or economic principle that actually makes people act against their self-interest? And this is going to get to my example later on.
Well, actually, if you think of it, yung corruption can be thought of as the product of a rational behavior. Na parang just like crime, just like any other behavior, given the carrots and sticks that are in existence right now, parang di mo naman siya gawin kung masyadong malaki yung disadvantage. So parang you do corrupt acts because the benefits are much larger or at least they exceed yung costs. So halimbawa, dun sa pag nahuli ka sa number coding halimbawa or any other traffic violation, ano yung incentive mo na mag-offer ng lagay dun sa traffic enforcer? Kasi halimbawa, kung merong supply and demand, halimbawa, so willing kang gawin yun, tapos nafe-feel mo na willing din yung traffic enforcer tumanggap ng lagay, tapos wala namang CCTV, walang ibang tao. So parang all of the incentives are in place for that corrupt act to happen. So parang to prevent such things, so going back to the point of institutions, kaya merong field na institutional economics yung behavior ng mga tao can be shaped by the institutions around them.
Okay.
So halimbawa, dun sa customs naman, 'di ba, yung mga may marami ding lagay diyan. Kaya 'di ba, ang proposal yung mga table dapat walang drawer or dapat may mga parang ganun. So
glass lahat ng walls.
Exactly. So parang yung mga nudges, behavioral nudges, and then segue to dun sa another field which is behavioral economics na parang ano yung mga nudges na mga simple design tweaks sa pagkapaligiran natin halimbawa that will disincentivize or incentivize certain behavior. So at the end of the day, corruption is about incentives.
Exactly. I mean, that's a good point to end that point on, because feeling ko we're all about disincentives and not about it. Kasi if it were all about incentives, if it were all about disincentives, di ba? Gawin natin glass yung walls para literally transparent. Di ba? It just pushes you to more absurd images, di ba? Like it literally pushes an airport employee
to swallow
money. Di ba?
Pero may CCTV pa
Pero may
lang.
CCTV
Diba?
So yung connect doon is, so it's not just about putting all these things in place, but you also increase the likelihood of being caught. So example,
but again, that's
confidential
disincentive.
fund. Diba? Talking about corruption, confidential fund, the current system, walang malinaw na audit. You only need to give a certification na ginastos ko to according to that. Which one is more prone to corruption? Kung ganong certification lang or may actual audit na you have to itemize, you have a receipt, and then may outcomes assessment na ano ba talaga na-accomplish mo.
But again, that's disincentives. And the disincentives, people are still drowning in, I mean, even in the we do have systems, no? We do have disincentives and regulations, but even when it's there, people are literally drowned. Even with NGOs dedicated to it, even you have limited bandwidth to show people. I mean, when was the last time something went viral kasi nakita mo na merong confidential funds ang isang LGU, diba? That was one moment. And that seemed like so long ago when you did that post. I'm more curious about the incentives. Like, ito yung example ko. There's nothing more corrupt, I think, than a Congress that is built on political dynasties and whose power for each and every one really centers around land. hanggang ngayon, di ba?
Yeah.
It's still the landowners and it's still the dynasties. And we all know that political dynasties and inequitable access to credit is one of the things that hampers everything in the Philippines. But you have these people who, di ba, how do you convince them of the economic wisdom of any economic wisdom in you have to let go of the political dynasties and somehow we have to not only redistribute land, but we have to find a system where people can have equitable access.
Yeah. I think it's a combination. So you set up all the disincentives, the rules of the game,
But they
to
want,
discourage.
Congress pa rin yung
I
magpapass
know.
nun.
So the ang incentive doon is getting elected. So
Yeah.
that's why medyo mahaba-habang proseso to of convincing people. Ano ba yung relationship natin sa politicians? How should we look at them? Na kapag nangurakot sila, it's not that we're not affected. We are in fact affected. So kailangan ma-realize din ng taong bayan na we're not asking for favor from government, but government's actually using our money, taxpayers' money yan. So that's why we should demand accountability. And if they're doing well, reducing corruption, providing you the things that you need from government, the ultimate incentive or reward for that behavior would be getting elected in office. Kaya lang yung buong game na to, hindi ganun yung framework sa Pilipinas eh. Kaya doon papasok yung need for public education, making us realize na, kahit na, and this is what I'm trying to do with my TikTok eh, na kahit na minimum wage earner ka, hindi ka nagbabayad ng income tax, taxpayer ka. Every time kumain ka ng instant noodle, taxpayer ka. Uminom ka ng kape, taxpayer ka. Sumakay ka sa jeep, taxpayer ka. And lahat ng taxes na binabayad mo, may kapalit yan binibigay mo yan sa gobyerno because you're expecting something in return. So pag di nila nabigay, wag mo silang i-reward, wag mo silang iboto.
JC, alam ko, notwithstanding, all the posts that you do, all the criticism, I know you do consultancies. You've consulted with governments from local to departments and so on. Do politicians listen?
Well, they will listen. I think going back to that point of education, I think education can really shape yung demand of ordinary Filipinos when it comes to, and shape their relationship with politicians as well. Pero I think I come to realize over the years na many of our problems really are rooted in education Na halimbawa, may mga disincentive ka dun sa vote buying halimbawa. Pero paano mo pipigilan yun to begin with, na isi-shape mo na yung isip ng mga tao na, ito ay masama, ito ay counterproductive. I think education
But what other message is there that hasn't been delivered? Di ba? Na wag nyo ibenta. Di ba? Pati nga yung message na kunin mo yung pera, pero wag ka magpa-influence. Nandun na lahat, di ba?
Economics pa rin yan, yung sa reward and kasi yung intertemporal benefit. Kasi pag election, you immediately get both pag vote buying, di ba? They give you 500 pesos, 1,000 pesos. Nakuha mo yan. Yun lang yung value or incentive na nakikita mo sa pagbili ng boto. But you don't realize the disincentive or the negative effect of voting a corrupt politician na, hindi ako makakaroon ng libreng pabahay, palpak pa rin ang health system, yung quality education. Pero kasi yun ay future benefits pa rin that you will get. So, again, that's economics, yung intertemporal valuation ng flow ng benefits. Na medyo mahirap ipaliwanag, but I think with continuous education...
I-breakdown mo ngayon, intertemporal.
Intertemporal. Ibig sabihin, nare-receive mo yung reward at different times.
So, what's an economic solution to that? I mean, what's a best practice to that? How do you intervene or mitigate against intertemporal
the disconnect?
How do you make that connection?
Public education pa rin yung pagpapaliwanag
pero yung pagpapaliwanag essentially ang message mo pa rin is laliman niyo yung pag-iisip niyo at habaan niyo yung PC niyo. That's the message to parang alam ko naghihirap tayong lahat pero kailangan ma-imagine niyo to. Kailangan
ma-realize na yung pagboto ng maling kandidato actually has an effect on you. Iniisip mo lang hindi at ang short-term benefit mo lang at least nakakuha ka ng lagay ng election.
Yeah.
Pero yun nga, we have to realize na role ng gobyerno na kahit naghihirap ako, bigyan ako ng opportunity magkaroon ng maayos na bahay, maayos na edukasyon, access sa kalusugan. Minsan kasi hindi natin yun naiisip na karapatan natin yun Na makukuha lang natin yung kung chika natin si barangay captain or si mayor.
Kaya ako naniniwala na ako dun sa sinasabi na yung mga politician ay parang they would hamper yung mga efforts toward educating or improving the education system. Kasi they know na once people are a lot more educated, magre-resist na yan or parang they will break away from the system.
But are they, ewan ko parang I see our politicians as captured, di ba? By their own families, by lifestyles that they had. I wouldn't, personally, I don't think that I've judged them to the point na ayaw nilang matuto yung mamamayan, di ba? I don't think that's where, ang sa akin, I think they're having a hard time fighting the systems that put them in place.
Sana.
But I do think they want. Hindi, ewan ko. Kayo, like I said, you've consulted for politicians, you've consulted for, you've worked for government, you've worked for government one way or the other. Di ba? Parang, you must have found na there are people who listen,
yes,
there are
definitely.
people.
Definitely. There are. But yun nga
But what makes them listen? What makes them say na, okay, sige, I'm gonna try that?
I think moral compass siguro and prinsipyo ng mga tao na nandun to pursue yung genuine reform and yung leadership kung nasan ba talaga yung puso.
Is there an
or
economic
intention.
principle that basically expresses to politicians na, okay ka na eh. Di ba, parang, yaman ka na eh. Di ba, is there an economic principle? Is there an economic way of communicating that and making that point na, okay ka na eh, di ba? Parang hindi ka naman kailangan maging multi-billionaire, di ba? Parang
Di ba
okay ka
walang
na. Now you
satiation
can
point?
That's the concept.
Walang what's the
Walang
concept?
concept ng satiation point.
Hindi ka mabubusog.
Unlimited
Yun.
greed. Yeah.
Hindi ka mabubusog.
Parang once you come to taste yung benefits of power, halimbawa, parang you're craving for more, na parang it expands your horizons.
And
parang
that's a reality.
possibilities. There are concepts in microeconomics yung satiation point.
No, but when you say it's a concept, kayo, as economists, do you subscribe to that? That there's no such thing as, wala yan, hindi mabubusog yan.
Maybe nagbabago din yung rewards. Kasi at some point, I assume, for example, kahit sobrang yaman mo na. For example, Bill Gates, they're super wealthy, di ba, with the monopoly of Microsoft before. But at some point, they also set up a foundation. So I guess, it's still parang a personal reward, but a different psychic reward that you get.
Legacy.
In health. Legacy mode ka na, ganyan. So maybe, but ang basic kasi assumption is that an individual is selfish. You look at what is good for you. But maybe the definition of what is good for you nag-change over time. So, you need to find a politician that has a different set of
Because
goods.
I can think of many political families right now, from the very top to local governments, where you can say, where I think you can see na iba yung motivation nito. It's still self-interest, but it's a different thing that you're appealing to.
Siguro yung challenge is how to develop yung critical mass ng mga public servants na, hindi selfish masyado
interest.
Or parang, kasi ngayon parang I would think na yung incentives for selfishness, they dominate pa rin. Pero so how to flip the point or flip the table?
It will take a lot of irrational behavior on everybody's parts. Diba? From the voters to politicians, to elected leaders, to business people, to the church, to religious leaders. It will take a lot of irrational behavior for a lot of things to get right.
And in a way, medyo nahuli na nga si Econ in considering irrational behavior. Kasi, as we know, yung economics kasi, for the past decades, ang assumption talaga niya is a rational man. Pero it was only in recent decades na, irrational pala tayo. Parang sabi ko, hindi nyo ba nakuha agad yun? Pero interestingly, si Adam Smith, considered as the founder of modern economics, dun sa kanyang Wealth of Nations, 1776, actually, meron na siyang mga snippets doon na parang naiintindihan niya na yung irrational behavior, yung behavioral economics, nandun na yung nuggets or yung seeds noon na parang it was only later in the game nga na parang modern economists came to realize or incorporate that in mainstream. So, in a way, economics nag-evolve din naman siya to try to take into account what's really happening in society. So yeah, rational versus irrational man.
But also, yung set of values ng isang society I think plays an important role on how we design incentives, how we respond to incentives. Ang unique, very unique sa Philippine culture yung pag-value natin ng future ng mga anak natin.
Yeah.
Di ba sa US, pagka nag-18 ka, bala ka na sa buhay mo. Sa Pilipinas, yung mga magulang, kung kaya mo mag-save para sa magkabahay yung anak mo, lahat na pwede mong ibigay, di ba? If we can think of it from that perspective na if we allow the deterioration of the quality of government, na kapag ganito pinabayaan natin, well, maybe sa mga ibang mayayaman, kasi they can buy assets abroad and they just send their kids abroad, no? Iba na yung citizenship nila. Pero tayong middle class, na hindi naman kayang bumili ng citizenship abroad, tayo din naman maiiwan dito eh. So, if we really value our children, I think ikabit natin doon na sila sa future ang magmamana ng corrupt na sistema.
Yeah.
Sila ang mamumroblema kung wala sang pagbayad sa ospital.
When was the last time we as a society did something, I mean,
Really
economically sound, really responding to an economic policy intervention that goes against our rational selves, our self-interests, and whether you take that as society as a whole or a victory in legislation or just by force of some really one politician with really strong will. When was the last time we had a moment like that?
We went out and think beyond ourselves.
And institutionalized something that's still there with us.
But I mean, a lot of people still continue to do what we're doing now, right? We continue to educate people.
Institutionalized.
To fight disinformation.
Subukan mo. When was the last time? What's one last economic? RH.
The universal healthcare is actually a good concept. Concept pa rin, diba? Kasi we haven't perfected it. But it's a good economic, social program na if we are able to make it work, malaking benefit sa ating lahat yan.
Yeah, JC.
Not to be political, pero I think yung EDSA People Power Revolution
That's
was
actually
an
what I
act
was
of
thinking.
parang, if you think of it, parang irrational siya in a way na parang, what would make millions of people come out of the streets to, kasi if you think of it, parang that was also a reaction to the economic policies of the old Marcos administration, na parang, and similar to what happened to Sri Lanka last year, di ba? Parang sinugod nila yung presidential palace, pero that was a reaction to the balance of payments problem, inflation, food crisis, etc. Na parang it was time to stop this, and that happened, that revolution happened, and then we set up institutions, yung constitution, etc. So I think moments like that are rare, pero parang that gives a glimpse dun sa how you go out beyond your own self-interest and think of the broader society.
Anyway, we're talking to JC Punongbayan and Cielo Magno. Kilala niyo na po sila, mga ekonomista ng bayan, ekonomista ng TikTok. But you know the drill already. Isang oras na po itong show ko. I will continue my conversation with them dahil hindi pa naman ubos yung
halos maubos na.
Sige, tatagdagan natin. Ako, itutuloy ko lang po, but you will have to leave us. But you can catch us again next Thursday, 9 p.m. Manila time on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Google Podcast. At saka sa Puma Podcast. That's the podcasting group that I and JC is involved with. Nag-podcast din ako with Cielo. You can catch Puma Podcast. We'll also be uploading all the audio from our show there. Ako po si Robbie Alampay. This is Roundtable. Thank you for joining us.